As Ron said, you know, there's a lot of talk at the moment about food and the future in the world and whether we're entering the golden age. And, you know, we've certainly in the city and at the big end of town, it's the topic. We get these estimates, FAO, etc. We get some of the wildest statements. The point is that that may or may not happen. I mean, real commodity prices have been dropping for the last couple of thousand years. And I've often said that the dropping in real commodity prices is actually, I think, one of the certainties of life. There is some evidence that we are in the middle of a bit of a turn at the moment, and certainly if you graph commodities, look at commodities like wheat, like sheep meats, mutton, lamb, that since about the early 80s we have an increasing trend in real price in those products. And so perhaps we do have some structural issues at the moment. Who knows why? I don't think it's as simple as just increasing population, but perhaps we are going into a period of higher prices, and I think all I can say is really, so what? It'll be fun if it happens, but I don't think we can relax. I think the thing that drives our businesses, and certainly drives my business, is productivity gain. We're on a treadmill. It keeps going no matter what we do, and we've just got to keep running faster and faster. And I don't think there's any reason to think that that will change. If we can do that, if we can keep our costs low and prices go up, well, all the better. But to me, the way to manage an agricultural enterprise and to manage your risk is to have a low cost of production, pure and simple. So I really think we need to keep that very, very much in mind. As far as agriculture is compared with productivity, too many numbers, but I do think that we do perform reasonably well. These are productivity gains per year over those periods, and you can see that agricultural productivity gain is very respectable in this country, although in a minute I'm going to get stuck into a few different issues, but in general it compares well to other industries. You know, look at mining, which is pretty awful really. I suppose there are some good reasons for that, but communication obviously is up on top, but agriculture has been a reasonably good performer in terms of productivity improvement. And of course, as farmers, I would argue that that should be the main focus in our business, is productivity improvement. It's relentless stuff. There's some talk about whether productivity improvements are slowing, and I think there's reasonable evidence that they are, and that's a big concern, and I suspect that may be one of the reasons that we may be entering a period of higher prices, is that we have not invested fully in research at the production level now for probably 20 or 30 years, and I think that that's going to come back and bite us, and it's probably going to take another 20 or 30 years until we get our act together, and that should just about see me out. But hopefully, when I look back at my family in agriculture, conclusion I've come to is you can be born into the wrong lifetime in this job, and I'm just hoping I've been born into the right lifetime, and I hope we all have been. But so there are some, you can see there's productivity increases have been occurring, but they seem to have been slowing a little bit in some industries and increasing in others. It's all timing. At labour, we've had huge increases early in a period. More lately, our labour efficiencies hasn't been increasing as much. But yeah, so whether they're slowing or not is a bit of a moot point, but it is interesting. If we look at more closely at what we're doing as farmers, the industry figures are productivity gain across probably one of the most interesting sectors here, sheep, beef and cropping. We can see the sheep productivity gain has been woeful, and what's really scary is that productivity gain in meat sheep, crossbred sheep, as they used to be called, has been quite good. and it's being dragged down by wool. And of course, as we know, the wool industry is in the doldrums, and there's some real issues there. We're looking at an industry in decline. The beef industry looks respectable. Still, when you realise that that game is driven off what's been happening in the north, off the back of the BTEC scheme and things like that, where they're introducing some very high-tech type technologies into their systems. They're doing things like they're weaning their calves, things like that. It makes a big difference. But if you consider that most of that's in the north, again, stagnating productivity improvement in beef cattle in this country. Cropping, much more respectable, and an interesting case really of an industry that, to a large extent, seems to have some perspective of how important on-farm productivity is. Has its issues, of course, and we can maybe talk about them a bit later, but they're the sorts of gains we've been seeing, and it is a concern because the overall productivity, obviously those differences become reflected in enterprise mix and etc. and land use, but on a larger scale, I think we're not only competing with each other, we're competing for capital in the world capital markets, and if we don't have high productivity gains, capital will flow elsewhere, and our whole rural industry will suffer in terms of financial capital and intellectual capital. And we've certainly seen that in the rural industries, but again, particularly in the livestock industries, and again, particularly in the wool industry, where there's been a flight of intellectual capital till there's virtually nothing left. It's terrifying stuff. But again, productivity gain is what makes us compete with land use, but it makes us compete with other industries and other uses for capital. It's all very important to us. Oh, that's just a bit of a note that Dave had come across somewhere. It's very interesting that productivity increase in the ruminant industries has been much slower than in the non-ruminant industries. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that, but I suspect one of them is that just ruminants aren't very efficient animals, and you've got a lot further to go when you're turning energy into money or grass into money or wheat or whatever, as compared to non-ruminants. And so we are behind the 8 ball again, and it's just more reason, I think, to pedal a lot harder. And just remember about that treadmill. Just something a little bit more positive. These are some flock projections for the sheep industry, and you can see we've got the purple line is MLA and whatever's predictions of numbers. The green line is Kimball Curtis's stuff from the Western Australian Department of Agriculture. Kimball's currently predicting we'll eat the last sheep sometime in 2014. And you know, it's obviously that won't happen, but there is good reason to believe that pulling up the decline in sheep numbers is going to be slow and is very positive for sheep prices, for sheep meat prices. And so, I mean, I'm actually reasonably bullish on sheep meat, simply because the only way we're going to keep a flock is if we kill less, and that'll cut supply. And we've seen the results with, you know, mutton at $5 and lambs at over $6, and quite crazy prices, or quite enjoyable prices. So where are these gains going to come from? And I'll just briefly go through a few. We've lost, according to Dave's figures, over the last 50, 60, 70 years, we've lost about 110,000 farms. A damn good thing, I'd say. And we need to keep losing them. All of these silly schemes that we have, which keep farmers on the land, are holding those of us who want a longer term viable industry back by artificially keeping up land prices and etc. We need rationalisation in our industry. We need fewer, larger farms. and we need to ditch a lot of these very silly government schemes that are out there. Now, I'm not saying that I support, all the pain that involves, but there's ways of ameliorating that without destroying an industry. Another area where gains can come from, and I think this is an interesting one for the grain industry. This is a graph of corn yields, and you can see it starts to rise fairly rapidly sometime around the Second World War. Combination of genetics, artificial fertilisers, MCPA, I imagine, those sorts of things. And it's risen pretty well ever since. Somewhere in there, probably in the 80s, we start to see better rotations coming in and stuff like that. In the last 10 years, we can see that we have above trend gains in corn productivity, and that's basically due to the use of GMO varieties. Now, I think that's a real issue for Australia, where we are being very reticent about introducing GMO varieties, and I think in the long term it is a very silly thing to allow your competitors to get an edge on you, and that's what we're doing in this country. I've had quite a bit to do with cotton, and the gains that have come in cotton production through Roundup Ready and Bollgard and all those sorts of things is just astounding, and has cleaned up the industry and ensured its future. We are losing ground in the canola industry and potentially in the future in the other grain industries, and if we're going to compete in a world that needs more food and grain, we must embrace it, because otherwise I think we risk going, as grain growers, I'm calling myself a grain grower here, I can't believe it, but I've got a little bit in, and I think we risk going the same way as the wool industry's going. And the wool industry is something that's very dear to me and I'm very passionate about, but let's face it, it's got some structural issues. But technology is crucial. One of the technologies which is out there and which we know has huge potential is genetically modified organisms, and we have to take a positive view of it. Where else will gains come from? Simple stuff. Imagine if we had a more acid-tolerant lucerne. The gains from growing lucerne pastures and productivity are just immense, and if you could increase the areas where they grow. Imagine if we had drought-tolerant phalaris. Imagine a species of phalaris that had survived east of the Hume Highway. Hardly the Newell, but our current varieties struggle when they're at optimum stocking rates anyway. And so I think that there are things like this. Tettera is some sort of weird species which I'd never heard of until Dave told me about it yesterday, but it sounds fantastic. But these things are things that are in sight. These aren't blue sky things. They're boring things that if we put the resources in within 5 years, we will have them to apply. And this is the sort of stuff that we need to be focusing on. Livestock, we've got to do it better. I hate to harp on it. Genetics, huge potential in genetics. Our current improvement rate in the wool industry is about 70 cents per ewe per year. Potential is about $2. Anyone who's having a go should be going somewhere near that. We've lost the plot. The meat sheep job they're doing a much better job. But we've just got to do it better. We have come a little way, but not far enough. Those years I think are out of old Albert Austin's book about the merino there. I actually look after some of the remnant of Samuel McCackey's estate. There's some of his. That's why it's only a remnant. And there are other things with showing incredible potential, things like genomic selection. And the interesting thing about genomics, I think, is that although it's whiz-bang and complex technology, it's looking like the way that it will increase our rate of genetic gain is by simply increasing accuracy of selection and decreasing generation intervals. Really basic stuff. and huge potential there. We need to focus on these things. Another area is to understand more fully the implications of our enterprise decisions. Now, this graph's a little complex, but as I actually did this work, and so I'm going to bore you with it a bit, but what this is this is the output from a budgeting model that takes a farm plan over a 5 or 10 year period and brings in all sources of variation, price, seasonal, everything. All risks pretty much are brought in. It then models that farm on quite a sophisticated basis, and it models the farm and the enterprises over a 10 year period and comes up with whatever information out of that you want. But what it allows you to do is not only look at your simple old gross margin, but it allows you to look at the risks in an enterprise. And so here we can see, for instance, we've got cattle which are basically less profitable than anything all of the time. This brings in price risk as well. And there's nothing new in that, but it sets it out nicely. This is for a particular area farm, of course. It may be different on another farm, but although that is a pretty general comment on cattle. We've got composite sheep, which probably on average are as profitable in this particular area. And I don't mean here, I mean where this was graphed for. They are more probably about average as profitable as crop, but they don't have the upside, and they may not have the downside, although it's not too major. When you look at it in some areas, you'll see a major downside on the cropping side and a major upside. And similarly then you've got your grain where you've got that huge upside. But I think making enterprise decisions based on risk, a full assessment of risk, is something that we haven't done well in the past, but those tools are becoming more available, and I think that's a really interesting area. And you can look at 3 different areas and come up with 3 completely different sets of graphs which define an area. If you're out on the northwest plains, it will always be more profitable to crop. If you're in Western Victoria, it'll probably be there'll be a big tail on the cropping side, depending on how prone a property is to waterlogging. Anyway, it's just another area where we can increase our performance. Another one, this one, there's an opportunity with larger farms and better capitalised businesses. These are the correlations between wheat yield on a group of properties owned by, 3 properties owned by one owner. They're about 200 kilometres apart. And you can see that the correlation between wheat yields is very high, between 0.7, 0.6, 0.8. Now, the reason I actually did this work, this owner was telling us that he had his risk management sorted out because he had so many properties. But of course, what this tells us is that he didn't, and that he's in fact had a very, very risky business. These are large properties. I think there's about 40 or 50,000 acres of wheat in the 3. Now, if you do those sums and you look at, but it is possible to design a portfolio of properties where those numbers are very low and even negative, which means that you can actually control your production risk. And so I think that's an area that has a lot of potential, and certainly an area that we're more and more doing. When we look at a portfolio of properties for a client, we might say, yeah, well, the Northwest Plains is very interesting, Southern Victoria is very interesting, Western Australia is very interesting, Southern New South Wales, I don't know, it never performs as well as it should. So it's the last 10 years it's been such a bad time here that we're all feeling a bit shaken, I think. And just keeping that in perspective, we have this, these are just some rural property values through to about 2005 or 6, so they're a bit out of date, but I think they really nicely illustrate a lot of what I've been saying. Property values are basically driven by productivity gain. Mixed farming has had the highest increase in property values because it's the best place to be. Western grazing has had the lowest because it's the worst place to be. Not only do they have natural disadvantages in that it doesn't rain, therefore they don't have pasture improvement, but they tend to run sheep, and they're devoid of intellectual capital in that industry. So I think it's nice to see an example. It's a bit sad if you're in the Western Division, but it's nice to see an example of capital readjusting its allocation, which is really what's happening in that graph. So, in summary, I think the big picture looks really positive. I mean, I think agriculture's been a good place for the last 20 years, and it's going to be a bloody good place for the next 20. But I don't want to rely on that. I think we've got to control the things that we can control, and that basically means on our farms we have to be low-cost producers. I think productivity is key, and I think there's plenty of scope to increase productivity by fewer, larger farms and allowing that to happen naturally through the use of new technology, and I think we need to keep the funds flowing into research, and research needs, at all levels, needs to be boosted, but on-farm productivity research especially. And by being rational with our enterprise decisions, I think there are ways of tweaking our risk as well. So, yeah, so I'm very positive about the future.
Two questions. I'll ask probably the more positive upscale first, which is research funding. Basically, farmers, when they've voted on that issue, and if you look at the wool one, probably not a good example, they voted to switch money back to bargaining from research rather than increase them. Yeah. We also have corporates, not only corporate farms, but corporate, the Monsanto buyers and that, spending an immense amount of money today on research, and we've got both the industry contribution and the government matching declining. Where do we go to get this upturn again in productivity? Second question, corporate farms in America and that have been part of the reason that local communities are shrinking fast. We've quickly seen businesses, machinery dealers, the produce merchants and that disappear out of American communities because of large-scale farms who have a tendency to purchase a lot of their assets out of the district. Where do you see Australia going with that issue?
Right, well firstly on research, I've got a very short-term memory, but I'll try and get it all covered. But firstly on research, yeah, it's a real problem. I mean, you know, we have an issue in the wool industry, of course, where most wool growers, and particularly the people that run the industry, don't understand what the drivers of profitability are, and they have therefore misallocated what small funds that we have. And that's tragic, and it's basically, unless it's changed very quickly, will be the end of the industry. As far as how we get research funded, I think it is a concern. Obviously, a lot of the big corporations a bit further down the line do a lot of work, and thank God for that. At least they know what their priorities are. We have little say as individuals, and that's true. Perhaps larger enterprises would allow more opportunity for research. I mean, I can see in our case, say we had 3 billion under management. Well, then we could fund our own research. 300 million, it's not really enough. But at 3 billion, we could do it. And we mightn't be sharing it too much, but that's not such a bad thing either. So it's a problem that has to be addressed, and it is a core problem. That's all I can say. We've got the example in front of us of what happens if you don't address it in the wool industry. I just think they're just a fantastic example of how you can get it wrong and the results. As far as corporate ag and local communities, now you're right, rural communities are suffering, but I think that's part of a wider cycle of development. And I don't think it's because of corporate or larger scale farms. And in fact, I think if you want to have a community at all, you have to have profitable farms. And you can't have profitable farms these days without scale. Yeah, and just on the corporate thing, my view is the most efficient model for agriculture is large-scale, well-run family farms that get the culture right. I cannot compete with them. In our GFA business, it's really hard to compete with them, and they are the benchmark for us. Obviously, most of the directors of GFA have reasonable-sized family farms as well, 40 to 150,000 DSE type places. And to me, they are the farms of the future. Yeah, I'm not scared of corporate agriculture. I think we're short of capital in this industry. I mean, I see a lot of farms, and I see a lot of dreadful things. I see a lot of rundown country. We need capital. The corporates are providing it. They'll come and they'll go. The ones that do it right might stay around, but if they're doing it right, that's good. So I think what's happening in rural communities is a symptom of a larger show, of which the corporate side is just it's also a symptom in a way.
You put up a graph of the increase in productivity of corn.
Yeah.
Started about 1935-36.
Yeah.
I think you'll find that increase was due to hybridisations.
Yeah, genetics.
So my first question is, has the other cropping industries lagged behind through not developing more hybrids? I know corn's a classic example, always had easier to do, better results. But we've had hybrid canola coming in the last 5-10 years. Hybrid wheat's never quite taken off. But is there a possibility here of big increases in productivity?
What I'm saying is that we've got to utilise every opportunity. But you're right about genetics and corn. That was the big step forward. And what scares me is that we are cutting ourselves out of the main game. It'll only take, at 1 or 2% a year, it'll only take 10 years, and we will not be able to compete on the world market with something like canola. So that'll be it. So what are we going to do with our rotations then? I mean, I know that growing canola is a gentleman's hobby. You certainly don't make any money out of it, but you've got to do it for your wheat yields. What are we going to do when it becomes even less profitable?